Hi, I'm Jonna Johnson, CEO of Nemertes. I'm here with my co-host, John Burke, CTO of Nemertes, and Scott Robohn, who is the founder of Total Network Operations podcast on PacketPushers, as well as the co-founder of the Network Automation Forum. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And Scott, can you tell us what is the Network Automation Forum?
So Network Automation Forum, or NAF, is essentially a grassroots organization focused on advancing network automation. We started about a year and a half ago. Chris Grundeman and myself, the co-founders, just started asking what's the holdup with the adoption of network automation. We decided that we're only two people and we need many more opinions. So we invited 350 of our best friends to our first event in November 23. We've had 3 events total so far, with over 500 in Denver in November 24, and we're heading to our next in May 25 in a European location to be disclosed very shortly.
Oh, it sounds like you've already got that decided what that is. So that's the conference that happens that happened in Denver this year.
Correct.
And do you do any workshops and things like that in between conferences, or is it just a conference series where people get together and do birds of a feather kinds of working?
So far, it's been just the conference series, but supplemented by heavy Slack interaction. Like, we have a very interactive community. We are also starting a NAFcast webinar series in 2025, where we could do more focused profiles of companies and organizations that want to put light on specific things. So we're gearing up to do more.
Okay, great. That sounds good. Well,
and if you can sum it up in like 10 words or less, not 10, 20 words or less, why is uptake on network automation so slow?
There are cultural reasons that are the primary barriers. I'm already above your 10-word limit. There's so many tools to choose from. There aren't really good architectural guidelines in place. It's very bespoke. And we know that there are many, many people who are trying different things in their networks, and they're learning as they go. And the people who attend NAF events, the AutoCon event series, both want help and want to help each other. Mm-hmm. And I get goosebumps saying that, because it's an incredible community that's been underserved. And Chris and I are blown away by what we see with the people just helping each other out.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I've always said it's mostly a matter of learning to love again after the first time the automation bites you hard.
Sure.
Well, I know that one of the things that we wanted to talk about, you and I specifically, and hopefully everybody else, is working on trust issues, actually, trust and alignment between the different groups in an IT team, the operations folks, the engineering folks, the architecture folks, leadership, getting away from us against the world or us against them kind of mentality, and really getting everybody, in the same harness, pulling in the same direction. I know I've had my experiences with this, even though most of my work experience has been in small enough shops that there was a very hazy line between engineering and operations, say, or engineering and architecture.
Right.
But what kinds of things are you seeing happening that make this still a really important topic for organizations?
Well, I'll give a tip of the hat to John Willis, who's a big thinker from the DevOps community. And he provided a keynote talk at the first AutoCon in 23, and got me thinking about the application to DevOps to network operations, and how things can fit and don't fit. And it got me thinking about, ops teams really are the last ones to get attention in vendor interactions, in budget allocation decisions, in actually figuring out how to maintain the infrastructure as resiliently and reliably as possible. Granted, some shops are small enough where the lines are hazy, but there is this line between, there's leadership, there's architecture folks, there's engineering folks, and then there's the ops team. And as they say, it flows downhill.
And it can be something bad or something good, like trust.
I'm keeping it a family show. That's right. So I've been putting a lot of thought in the last year or two. Okay, how do I help ops teams participate in their own rescue? How to protect themselves, how to be more proactive with evaluating new tech, and being more business savvy and understand how process and tool decisions actually connect to business and financial objectives. I won't claim that I've got it all figured out, but it's been a really fascinating area to dig into. And that's what's gotten me thinking about, okay, how do we rebuild the bonds between the folks at the top of that heap and folks at the bottom of that heap, to use an imperfect analogy, but that's where I'm coming from.
And I wonder if it can help to, for one thing, flatten that picture out and think of it, not as a hill down which things run, but as one of those cyclic diagrams. Things start in architecture, swing around to engineering, go to ops, and you just got to, start by closing that circle and linking the ops back to the architecture. As the next round of things happens, architects shouldn't be ignoring what ops can tell them, right?
So you couldn't have teed that topic up better. So building that internal connective tissue, right? How do you make sure there's the permeable osmotic membrane between the teams that are designing, implementing, and running the network? And I come from a very network-centric position. These ideas can apply to any other pieces of the IT suite, but I've kind of encapsulated the idea of an ops architect. Have somebody who's grounded in the operations team, but who is fully connected with the engineering, architecture, and leadership, that proactively gets involved in architecture and design decisions, that's included in vendor evaluations and meetings, making sure that ops requirements are part of RFPs and are solid requirements and not just afterthoughts that, okay, you ops team, you'll just work it out with the vendor TAC afterwards. No, get ahead of that and build it ahead of time so that those sustainability operations issues are part of the design from day one.
Absolutely.
Well, Scott, I do love the concept of an ops architect, but I want to try to sort of fit this into a slightly different framework that I heard about recently that I like a lot, which has to do with, people by nature are, especially in technology teams, are either disruptors, they like to blow everything up. They're optimizers, they take something and they make it better, or they're maintainers or keepers who, continually keep track of the process and why the process exists. And one of the challenges is typically your architects come from the disrupt optimize side of the house and your ops people come from the maintain side of the house. So how do you find someone or build someone with an ops architect mentality?
So it's a fair point, but I'll also add to it. There are lots of folks who have gotten into architecture roles that come up from the ops arena. So my first answer to your question would be, remember from where you came. And I mean, that's been the story of my career, right? I started out in ops and support roles and moved into other areas. And I'm intentionally not saying moved up into other areas. I've had the privilege of being able to do a lot of different fun things, but having that grounding in ops really helps me keep it practical. And so, per your comments, that's not everyone, right? And sometimes you need to craft that. Sometimes leadership just needs to work hard and figure out, okay, maybe I have somebody who has 75% of what I need in this role. How do I support them to get them the additional 25, 20%? It's never going to be 100%. There's real, and this is a DevOps idea, and this actually goes back to a gentleman named W. Edwards Deming back in the 30s to the 80s, who I studied as an industrial engineering undergrad. And now 35 years later, I have this full circle of, Deming basically said it's never a frontline person's fault. management and leadership need to define what the roles are, what the processes are, and enable people to execute. So leadership has to get their hands dirty.
And it's really critical to think when we talk about architects, a lot of times folks aren't taking on real architectural responsibility when they're figuring out the large characteristics of their networks. And they got to keep in mind, like if I'm an architect designing an office building, I'm designing with maintenance and operation of the building in mind. If I'm not paying attention to how much it costs to operate that building,
Exactly.
I'm going to deliver something to the people who are buying it that costs them way too much, and they wind up, selling it or knocking it down and building something else because it's too expensive. So it helps to keep in mind what an architect is supposed to be doing, which is, designing to live in, basically.
So again, another perfect lob pitch in for me at the plate here.
I'm waiting for the check, by the way. It hasn't arrived yet.
We'll work that out. It's I'll Venmo it after.
Okay, all right, that works.
So spot on, and think about all the adjacencies that an ops team needs to deal with. Your architecture team is going to be really focused on, okay, what physical locations are there? What's the connectivity between them? What do the logical overlays look like? Routing protocols and design, VPN structure and so forth. But the ops person has to figure out, okay, now I've got this design and this operational network, but I need to get all my, all the right counters, all the right telemetry. I'm probably creating my own automations, that weren't handed to me by the architecture team, because I know how to automate the processes and the commands that I need to use in the network. I also need to know about my Slack integrations or Teams integrations or other communication tools. I need to know how this works with my trouble ticketing system, Jira, or whatever you're using for that. And there's all these other pieces of the ops stack that don't come down from the architecture team. And when I say, ops teams have to protect themselves, they need to understand how all those technologies work together to meet whatever business, financial, and uptime goals that they're handed.
Are there things that people at the architectural table, metaphorically speaking, should be doing to make the network more automatable, to wrap it back around to where we started?
Sure. There's the question of what APIs are available from the vendor kit that you're using, right? That's probably one fundamental, and it's a tip of the iceberg question, right? Mm-hmm. There's not one API to rule them all for you Tolkien fans out there. But what do I have beyond the CLI to actually manage and operate the equipment? Having some knowledge of what tooling the ops team is comfortable with. Do you have people who are very Python literate and they're all writing their own bespoke scripts? Or have you made other vendor decisions on tools to operate, the equipment from vendor X that might be working on vendor Y's networking equipment? Those concepts and details need to be visible all the way at the architecture layer. And again, an ops architect would be the person advocating and liaising, with that type of information.
And Scott, this reminds me of a huge cultural problem that we see often in large organizations, which is that the tools are bought by somebody who does not have the level of familiarity you talked about. And as you were talking, I'm thinking, part of the problem is the selection criteria, and the selection process happens almost in a vacuum, where it might be the architecture and engineering folks talking to procurement and ops is never brought in. So they're suddenly told that everything they've done with their clever bespoke Python scripts gets tossed out, and they're using whatever giant monolithic whatever that just got dropped on them. Right. From a process perspective, I understand that what you're saying is if you had an ops architect, he or she would be engaged in this. But even without one, is there a process fix for this?
Well, sure. And I'm always careful to call out one size does not fit all, right? The bigger companies and bigger organizations have those more stratified organizational lines, but per John's comment earlier, smaller shops, the lines are fuzzier, right? I think you used the word fuzzy, right? So I feel comfortable reappropriating that here. There's always a way to work around things and define process. And you touch on, I think, a really visceral issue in networking in particular, where the explosive growth and build out of the internet, from in the 90s and into the aughts, really encouraged a lot of cowboy behavior, right? And I've talked with Ethan on this publicly, where, hey, as long as you get it done and you get that site up, I don't care how you did it. And it encouraged lots of holding on to knowledge, wanting to be a hero, and led to some real sloppy DNA that has carried on for decades.
I'm gonna push back a little bit, because basically, as though you and I and John are all remember the foundation of the internet, but let's remind ourselves that was a generation ago. So I'm laser focused right now on organizations in 2024 and 2025. My question again is, how do you from a process perspective get ops engaged in those decisions? Like when you said one size does not fit all, that may run entirely counter to a much bigger strategic decision that the organization has made. We deal with a lot of companies that say, no, we have a big rock strategy and we will make one size fit all. And the problem is those decisions get made at a higher level, like basically the CFO talking to the CIO. Right. And by the time it trickles down to the poor ops people and the poor engineering people and even the poor architecture people, it's kind of a fait accompli. So my question is, in a large organization in particular, how do you deal with that? And I think there are ways, and I think you know them, but I just want to get you focused on that.
Sure. So I would say individuals matter all the time. And, a wise CIO, even if they're handed these big rock objectives and there's a high level of abstraction, that CIO has got to know that this has to trickle down through my organization. And it's not just an ops issue, right? There's all sorts of, how do I make sure the right people get the right information? So
tools specifically. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So are you, how do you incentivize / force people to document, contributing information, automating documentation wherever you can. We saw some pretty interesting presentations at the last AutoCon 2 in Denver about automatic generation of documentation. Boy, that's not going to solve 100% of your issues, but if it solves 70%, that's progress, even 50%.
But I'm going to push back one more time and then drop it. But I want to understand specifically how you get ops engaged in those procurement problems, because my issue and the thing I've zeroed in on is essentially, if you buy the wrong tool for the ops people, you've kind of screwed them. And our goal is to build that trust, and you've dashed that trust if you're buying the wrong tool. So I get that documentation is a good thing. I'm still trying to figure out what process-wise, one might do to ensure that automation tooling is at least treated as something that is potentially excluded from Big Rock for reasons. Because otherwise, essentially what you're saying is, well, it doesn't really matter because you're all going to just be implementing some instance of the Big Rock that got picked. And so that's really what I'm looking at.
Sure. To make that concrete, again, that it's the people matter comment, and that CIO, that VP of network, whatever that leadership position is, needs to know their organization well enough to say, okay, who's my architecture lead? Who's my engineering and implementation lead? Who's my ops lead? And how do I bring those pieces together all the way from early technology evaluation through RFP construction, evaluation, and decision making, and keep those functional areas engaged through the whole process. So I don't mean to make that abstract or fuzzy, But I think that's a really important model, whatever names are used in a given organization or how much stratification there is. Does that align with what you're pushing on me for?
It's getting closer. I think the problem is sometimes it's still too late if there's been a strategic decision made in the organization to go big rock. And the problem is the people that are going to suffer from that are too far away from the strategic decision making to be able to weigh in. So even though you can say people matter, unless you're going to say every single, rank and file ops and engineering person gets to have a say in what the corporate procurement strategy is, which doesn't fly in large organizations, you'll run into some challenges. So
it doesn't. That doesn't scale, right? But again, if you have a representative, right? And I think the scenario you're describing is more the norm than the exception.
Yes, exactly.
And again, if I'm a large service provider or a carrier, right, not everybody's going to be able to register their opinion on everything. Right. But again, you have those functional leads. Yeah, I can't fix bad decisions that have already been made. I can work around them. I can work around them. But for the next time, does that CIO or that VP of technology VP of technology individual learn from past mistakes? Hopefully they have a continuous learning mindset and would be willing to do something differently the next time.
Well, and I think also for the folks that are listening, the one thing I would add is if you do have a big rock strategy, which by the way, we don't recommend, but we realize that carriers and large organizations often do, I would suggest clarifying the opportunities for carve out. So in other words, we have a big rock strategy except for X, Y, and Z, and then having the ops folks well aware of what X, Y, and Z might be and how to position their scenarios where X, Y, and Z applies.
Yeah, there should always be a carve out for it just doesn't do the job that we need done, because the whole point is to get the job done that needs doing. And so, and this is a place where the ops and the engineering folks especially need to do some self-evaluation. Is the big rock tool that you're being forced to examine and probably adopt really incapable of doing the job? Or is it just one that requires you to have a new skill set or doesn't do it as well as the tools that you've got in mind or maybe even already in place? But it can do the job. Understanding exactly where you're parting company with that strategy really helps you frame your choice as to whether to push and try and get back to or out to the solution you think is really right because it's best, versus acquiescing gracefully to the solution that is being forced upon you because it can do the job, to digging your heels in and saying, no, we need a tool that does X, Y, and Z, and this one only does X and half of Y. We really need the other half of Y and Z functionally. And so we need a different solution. Making those choices carefully, I think, is really crucial.
And the way you can enforce that is giving those functional areas veto power, right? Like if you have, maybe you have a limited number of veto votes you can cast, but if that all of X and half of Y just doesn't meet operational goals, that ops liaison, that ops architect should be able to say, sorry, full stop. This isn't going to enable us to meet the uptime and business goals that you've placed on me as an organization. And it's got to be tied to those real goals. It can't be, I don't like it, or it doesn't feel right. Even the ops folks need to understand what the ties are to organizational and financial objectives.
And it can't be that it works differently than what you were used to or what you prefer.
Totally. Yep.
Yeah. Folks who are doing the configuration-based automation versus command line-based automation, it's a big conceptual shift, but it's able
you might
to
have to make
accomplish, mountains of work for you if you engage the tool the way it's meant to be engaged.
So on different, let me, there's another great point to bring up here. We live lives of disruption, we got into tech. We asked for this life. So quit your complaining, right?
Well, so this is where I would respond with, I do love the disrupt, optimize, maintain, because it's easy to say, hey, we're tech, we're supposed to all be disruptors. Personally, I don't identify as a disruptor, even though I do disrupt, because I don't think disruption is necessarily a good thing. People treat it as like, I'm a change agent. I'm like, why would you change what works?
Yeah.
Unless you're changing it to something better, which is more the optimizer. But the challenge is ops people are sort of told, they're put by personality and role into the role of maintainer. So when
Sure.
you say, look, suck it up, you're a maintainer, but you're a maintainer in technology, which is fundamentally about change. I kind of would roll my eyes if I were listening to you as the manager. I'd be like, yeah, sure, boss, whatever.
Well, and I'm not talking about it as a role or personality attribute. I'm talking about it as the temperature of the water. That's my implication here is this is the oxygen that we're breathing. And, right now, the de jour hip example is what is AI doing to fill in the blank. And that's real, right? I'm not saying this is not a thing, but if we state it as reality, that means individuals need to be able to adapt, no matter what profile you fit there. And I like your profiles. I think they're
not mine. I actually stole them from a keynoter at a conference. But yeah,
well, I'm going to reappropriate them from you from now on.
Go for it.
But everybody needs to know that, look, individuals are going to need to adjust and organizations need to adjust. Why would I implement new technology and not be willing to reevaluate how I'm leveraging and managing that tech and those tools? So it's not just hey, you need to be reading after hours, or you need to go do that Kubernetes course on your own. The org also needs to be willing to look at, okay, what do we need to do differently here? And that's, I think, a huge gap. I think it's
Yeah, I would agree with that. And sort of coming back to our main theme, how do you strategically build trust among different silos? I think the answer comes down to both sides have to compromise a little. The ops folks have to be willing to accept that there may be suboptimal decisions for them based on broader strategic goals, and having that ops architect role is a good way to get that communicated effectively. And then the organization itself needs to understand that, look, you can't just sort of snap your fingers and say, we're going to go with, for example, a big rock procurement strategy, and we don't care about the implication on ops, because you need them up at the table telling you what the implications will be. And then you need to be making that decision whether you're willing to accept those implications or not.
Yep. And I would wrap around that, hey, we're all learning, as this change is coming at us individually and organizationally. And that very simple admission, from your organizational leaders, look, it's not just us telling you need to go do work on your own. We also need to learn, in different functional leadership areas and as an organization. John, you were going to say something.
Not me.
John Burke. I said John. Yeah.
Oh, it's the hazard of doing the John and Jonna show. Yeah, definitely.
Sorry. Yeah.
I was just thinking about how often the shiny object leadership philosophy, sometimes from outside IT, has an undue weight inside IT in bringing in new technologies before you really can make a value proposition that makes sense in your specific organization. It's not that it's not a great technology, and it's not that it's not ultimately going to be able to deliver value to you at some point. It's that right now, that's not clear, and bringing it in just because it's the shiny new thing. Management by magazine, we used to call that back in the day when people read magazines on airplanes.
Sorry, magazines? I'm not familiar with that.
Hey, is that words on paper? What is that?
It's retro. Anyway, that's a big influence here, because that has no input channel for the voice of even the architects and engineers and operators. Even the leadership in IT can be locked out of that one to some extent, handed it as, something they need to go do.
Well, and that's actually a great point, John, which sort of is a beautiful loop back to something that you said earlier, Scott, that, when John asked you, why aren't people doing more network automation? You said basically it's a cultural thing. And that cultural thing means that you have to have a two-way dialogue going between high-level strategy, mid-level strategy, and the boots on the ground. And it sounds simplistic to say that, but it's not, because essentially, if your CIO is willing to follow management by, shiny magazine or whatever, and doesn't build that, then you're really in a world of hurt and there's not much you can do about it. But conversely, if your ops team is unwilling to even make a minor change because they're so invested in that maintainer mindset, you're going to have trouble too.
I have a fun personal example of
Please.
how to implement. So, large part of my career, I was an SE leader and an SE VP. And I had two big categories of requirements that came to me all the time that I had no control over. New products coming out from my product team that I had to be able to support and spin up on, and customer organizational changes. And, being that variable speed transmission between the customer and the company. And one of the things that completely, I really loved it was looking at this as a puzzle. And okay, I've got stuff I need to get done internally and externally, and I've got this group of people, and I've got to find a way to match this group of people with these things we need to get done. And to say I would gamify it is an overstatement, but the fun
I'll just say it, guys. Tetris.
Yes, the bin packing problem.
Yes.
So that was always a blast for me. And I found if you had open conversations with people and exposed, here are the opportunities to do new things, to do different things, 90+% of the time, you'd find people who are willing to step up. And you can solve most of those Moneyball problems, right, with people willing to adapt within your team. And that remaining 10% or less, okay, maybe that's a new hire. Maybe it's incentivizing people to take on something maybe they're not initially interested in, but find a way to make it interesting for them. There are good ways to solve those problems. And I've just, I would love it when I was in those roles.
I want to throw in that I think one of the things you're making really clear in talking through that is that it's not something that just happens. It is something that has to be built, and it has to be continually rebuilt.
Roger, amen. And
I'll bring something up. I can't remember where this first, was presented to me, but in an organization, you have basically a bucket of trust, and you do things that build trust and you put stuff in the bucket, and you do things that break trust and you pull stuff out of the bucket. And if that bucket's empty, there's nothing you can do to move your organization forward if it requires trust, because you've exhausted the trust that was available. But if you have been assiduously building trust with your team by being trustworthy and by, aligning what you're doing with what the organization needs in the other direction, then you'll have that sort of cultural capital within the organization to bring change about, to move something forward. For a while, because again, you're pulling things out of the bucket as you do that, and hopefully able to stuff some stuff back in and keep the reservoir up. But boy, you got to think of it actively.
You're so right. And the one thing I'd layer on is that bucket drains a lot faster than you can fill it. The tiny pinhole, it doesn't stay a tiny pinhole. It blows the bottom right out of the trust bucket. And if we could pay for bumper music, I would ask for Billy Joel's "It's a Matter of Trust" as the outro music. I know we can't do that, but
we actually do have bumper music, but I don't know that we're using it. But I
think there's a hole in the bucket. Might be royalty free at this point.
Yeah, there's a hole in the bucket of trust.
That's
Yeah,
right.
right. But okay, guys, I think we've covered an awful lot of ground. This is really fantastic. Just kind of to recap, it sounds like what we're talking about is essentially to build that trust among ops engineering and architecture and leadership. What you're looking at doing is potentially creating a new role, certainly modifying your processes, particularly when it's around engagement, making compromises on both sides, including leadership. Hey, here's our strategic direction, but we're going to deviate from the general strategy for these specific reasons. And then last but not least, thinking in terms of that bucket of trust and actions that you can be taking to build that bucket of trust, whether you're ops, whether you're engineering, whether you're architecture, or whether you're leadership. Anything I missed?
Nothing that won't take us another hour to discuss. I think that's a great summary.
Well, in that case, we should book that other hour, assuming folks like it. And by the way, if you're listening, please do send us a note if you enjoyed this show. Hit us up at packetpushers.net/FU for follow-up. Let us know that you liked it or didn't like it and what you want to see more of in the future. And kind of moving on, Scott, how do you work with folks and on what sorts of topics?
So on this whole idea of improving network operations, I have the great pleasure of hosting the Total Network Operations podcast, also on Packet Pushers. Give it a listen. I'm having great conversations with both network operators and vendors who service the space and try to create dialogue there. I'm also taking what I'm doing and engaging with organizations. And if you're interested in having a conversation about improving your network operations, hit me on LinkedIn. Send me a DM. I don't know too many Robohns on LinkedIn. You should be able to find me pretty easily.
Yeah, and if you're not aware of it, it's spelled Robohn, Scott Robohn. Hit him up on LinkedIn. Thank you very much. That's it for today. Thanks for listening.